Welcome to DivCasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right, so while people are finishing up here, I'll just start with an announcement or two, and then we'll get going. First off, welcome. It's fantastic to see a pair like this here. I'm Aaron Hollander, Program Coordinator for Graphic Teaching. I know almost all of you. I have just a couple of announcements, and then I'll introduce our guests, and then we'll go off to the races. So first off, people are signing in now. If you haven't signed in yet, please do it at the end of the workshop. It's the only way we can give you graphic teaching credits, so do it. And feel free to get coffee at any time. I know it's important. We've got two upcoming workshops I want to draw your attention to. A week from today, next Monday the 13th at 4 p.m., so a half hour earlier, right here, we have a workshop teaching religious pasts, making historical studies transformational and relevant for college students. That'll be co-hosted with the Theology and Religious Ethics workshop, and perfect for those who like to arrive before 8 fashionably late. The next week, April 23rd, is the Quarterly Dean Seminar. And this quarter it's with Lori Patton, Dean of Duke Divinity School, Duke University, and incoming president of Middlebury College. And she'll be here with us on Thursday the 23rd from noon to 1:30. Please do RSVP for that, and you can note your lunch preference. First 25 RSVPs will get lunch with that. So we're very much looking forward to those two events. So, to introduce Professor Russell McCutcheon. Professor McCutcheon is Professor and Department Chair of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama. He has a PhD in religion from the University of Toronto and has since published and edited voluminously in Method and Theory in the Study of Religion, Sociology of Religion, and in the Politics of Classification, most notably in the category of religion, as we've seen in the book we have with us today. Among these works is Studying Religion, copies of which Professor McCutcheon has generously arranged to be sent here for our use and for our edification. I won't take any more time except to note that our running theme for the quarter, informal theme for the quarter, is Introducing Religion. So our workshop today kicks that off in some style. So please join me in welcoming Professor McCutcheon.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks to your dean for the kind invitation, and for, I guess it was first Brandon, whose email does provide for me access to your Wi-Fi system. That's my password, is ED Klein, so I assume that's somehow set up, but I won't tell you my password. But now Aaron, for answering all my many questions, well, what really will I have to do? So thanks for having me. I've got a paper that I wrote that's about a half hour that I thought, because I get the impression we have 5 hours together. Right? We have about 90 minutes together, I think, right? So I thought that could kind of set off. But before starting that, it's entitled, by the way, A Baker's Dozen of Tough Choices. That's what my paper. And I probably want to do something with this, but I would offer this to you. But before I do that, how many people here have teaching experience of any kind? Would you say you have teaching experience? And how many people here have taught an introductory course to the study of religion specifically? Wow. Here? Somewhere else?
Here.
Okay. Through the college, or who would be offering?
I run the undergraduate religious studies program.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
You're one.
So one.
And Emily just my TA.
Okay, so you've been involved. How many people, because I know there's a lot of different programs in the school, so how many people anticipate that this is something they either wish to teach, or more correctly, will be asked to teach someday, whether you wish to? So this is something that, well, thank you. So now what I'm going to talk about might be relevant. I'll read this through, and then hopefully it's just open conversation. Comments on the book, if you have it. You don't even have to talk about the book, because I make reference to it here, that from your point of view, I hope you see it as an EG. I said this last night. A few people went to dinner with me, a few students, grad program, the history and religions program, that I would hope you treat me as if you were the anthropologist and I'm the articulate native informant, because I think that's the way you really should talk to people, it seems to me, in my position, that you're gathering the data, trying to figure out how you want to do X, and I'm the native informant who does it in a very particular way, and here's what I do, and here's why I do it, here's my experience doing it. So a baker's dozen of tough choices. Taking seriously Jonathan Z. Smith's line, Jonathan's work, if anyone knows my work, has been deeply influential to me. From his contribution to Mark Juergensmeyer's unfortunately out of print Teaching the Introductory Course in Religious Studies, a source book, that, quote, there is nothing that must be taught, there is nothing that cannot be left out, end quote. A conclusion Smith draws from the practical constraints of any university class, for as he writes in the preceding paragraph, no course can do everything, no course can be complete. Taking it seriously, I decided to briefly consider here, simply as a means to start off our conversation, some of the choices that the instructor of an introductory course in our field, I think, likely has to make. More specifically, and given our specific context here today, I have in mind the early career instructor, ADDs teaching their own course for the first time, the newly hired assistant professor confronting a full teaching load along with research and service expectations, or even the instructor, whether full-time or part-time, who may be shuttling between multiple schools teaching large numbers of students, many of whom are probably at the lower undergraduate level. That is to say, the person getting their first request to submit a textbook order of their own, and thus the one who, in hindsight, I imagine myself to have been when I now look over those syllabi, which I still have on my hard drive, from my own World Religions and History, Religious Studies 101, and Comparative Religion and Introduction, Religious Studies 102, two courses that I regularly taught beginning in the fall of 1993 as an instructor at the University of Tennessee, where my own full-time teaching career began. I was an instructor on a one-year gig at Tennessee that turned into a second one-year gig that turned into a third one-year gig before the person who was in senior administration returned to the department, and thus the budget line dried up that was funding me and another person to replace him. They got two for the price of one. And with where I started my own career in mind, not to mention all three of those universities where I've worked in the U.S., I've worked at three different public universities. Came here in 1993, worked in Missouri, and now at the University of Alabama since 2001. I also direct these comments toward those teaching in the public university, the place where I'd wager many of you will probably end up working at least some point in your career, if that is one is lucky enough to earn one's living by means of the skills that we acquired in doctoral work. They're not very conscious not to the situation of the job market today, something I'll talk about in a bit. So returning for a moment to those early syllabi. What strikes me now about those two courses is how overly ambitious they were. Or maybe I should say how overly ambitious I was in designing them. When hired, which was about 18 months before defending my dissertation at the University of Toronto, I was told I must use Hughes and Smith's World Religions, the still in print and lightly revised version of his Cold War era textbook, Religions of Man. And if memory serves, that's how that book entered my dissertation research. I was not reading that book, but it ended up in my dissertation and it ended up in my first book, which I think constitutes one nice example, at least in my career, of the intersection between teaching and research. But I added to the list Ninian Smart and Richard Hecht's once significantly subtitled Primary Source Anthology, Sacred Texts of the World, a Universal Anthology, as well as John Himmel's A Dictionary of Religion, Penguin publishes that, a book that I added to many of my textbook orders in those early years, inasmuch as I then made learning world religions vocabulary a key element of my courses. What's the difference between Shruti and Smrti, the test would say. As for Tennessee's other, more thematic, but no less encyclopedic introduction to the field, and in which I had a free hand in setting the book order, I opted for no less than 5 books, including works by Plato, Freud, and Jung, along with Bill Payton's thematic intro book, Religious Worlds, published by Beacon Press, still in print, I believe, some of you may know it, whose chapters are on such topics as myth, ritual, the gods, purity, as well as John Lydon's edited book, Enduring Issues in Religion, a book of excerpts of series of debates on ethics and what does this position say, what does this position say, organized largely around the world religions model, but whose various examples of ways of defining religion I found to be particularly useful then. But whether the material is divided up in terms of world religions or arranged thematically, My goal, if memory serves, and when I look at those old syllabi, in both courses was to fit it all in. For all I knew, my possible reappointment as an instructor hung in the balance. I was lucky enough to be reappointed twice, as I said. And so I seem to recall feeling that a demonstration of universal competence was likely linked to my sense of professional legitimacy in both the eyes of my students, who I really wasn't all that much older than at the time, not to mention my new colleagues, scholars who, to me at least, seemed infinitely more knowledgeable and thus authoritative than I. So I think that's a very real situation an early career person finds themselves in. I think it's a situation that communicates an awful lot of insecurity. So how do you deal with that and respond to that might be one of the issues involved. Today, just over 20 years after first developing these courses, I no longer teach a local women's survey. I stopped doing that about 15 years ago when I became chair of the department, which for some reason, at least to me, for some inexplicably good reason, at least to me, wasn't even offering the course when I first arrived there. So it's not like I killed the world religions course that time. It wasn't even being offered. Some years before it had, but it wasn't even being offered. Though my colleague Stephen Rainey, if you go to our website, you can see the faculty, the group of people I work with, now regularly teaches that course. It's only about 3 years old. But it's a strategic way on his part to invite students to, intro students, to consider problematizing that very way of naming and grouping people. And he works that slowly into the course. And when I do teach the introductory course, which is a larger enrollment class with between 100 and 150 students that I offer at least once, and sometimes, like this year, twice a year, I require students to purchase just one little book. Those students often always use an online dialogue by Plato also. The book I use is my own, which, FYI, requires me to make an annual transparency claim to the University, Alabama Ethics Commission, and I have to state what I'm doing with the royalties of that book. State law dictates that I cannot benefit from monopoly over my students' textbook buying. So not every state does that necessarily, but something to keep in mind if you assign your own materials, depending on what state you're in. A book that you have here today is a piece of data for your own consideration. If pressed, I'd say it's not a textbook at all, but a resource useful, I think, in almost any class that merely sets the table for an instructor who then needs to bring a considerable number of dishes to their own meal. I think that's what, I see the book as a leg up, but you've got to figure out how to teach your course. I'm not a fan of textbooks. The book, which includes as an afterword a short essay of Jonathan's on teaching, arose from years of developing and teaching the course. In fact, I recall visiting here long ago, and whether he recalls it or not, talking to Bruce over coffee about the book that I hoped to write, emphasizing that it was not meant to be a textbook. And so despite my efforts to continually revise the class and to ensure it incorporates new examples drawn from current events my students will hopefully recognize, who could resist in a course on the definition of religion, drawing in Religious Freedom Protection Acts and how relevant is that, right? But if it sometimes seems to my students that I'm teaching to a text, I'd like to think that it's because the text is mimicking me and not the other way around. As you might therefore guess, I long ago stopped reading lectures verbatim, as I certainly did in those early years in Knoxville, especially when, right off the bat, teaching a course that was entirely new to me, entitled Myth, Symbol, and Ritual, which my new chair asked me whether I could teach in a phone call not long after I was hired, but prior to my arrival in Knoxville. That was a curve. I was not hired to teach that as far as I knew. Then he called me. They had a retirement, the late Stan Lusby, who graduated from Chicago, before going to Miami University of Ohio in 1955, and then moving to Tennessee, where he was chair in the early 70s. So this popular upper-level undergraduate course, and I don't know if you think this way, and I don't want to, reveal the man behind the curtain, but depending on who you're talking to, popular means a reliable producer of credit hours, right? Like I'm talking like a department chair, and that's one of the messages of the paper is, are you thinking like a prospective member of a department, right? It needed an instructor, right? He retired. Of course I can. I recall answering. And then scrambled to begin writing out full lectures, right? Well, I'm going to stand in front of a group of people and stick to my text, right? Among other resources, crucial to me was Brian Morris's still important book, I think. If you know the book, Anthropological Studies of Religion, an Introductory Text. It's hardly introductory. I think it's kind of an authoritative book in many ways. If you're looking for, 25 good pages on Freud, and I don't know much about Freud. Luckily, the days of being one class ahead of students and standing in front of them, wedded to a text, is long over, unless, of course, I'm invited somewhere such as here to give a talk. Then I knew you saw that irony. So then I stick to the text to keep me from rambling. After all, we don't have much time together, and so we probably can't afford too many digressions. When I compare what I do now to what I did then, what immediately catches my eye, therefore, is that nothing I do today has what I would think to be a grandiose, totalized intent, making my current classes much less ambitious than those old syllabi. I'd be happy to send them to you if you email me. But I don't think unambitious is actually the correct word. For although I have no doubt changed over the years, and while I've also become increasingly integrated into the bureaucracy that is higher education, after all, I've been a department chair for 10 years now, I'd like to think that I've learned to make some of the choices that Smith talked about when drawing his readers' attention to the fact that one university course, if you've read this particular article, at least taught the calculus of my school, the timing of my school, amounts to just 40 hours of instruction time per semester. And that's not counting the days off for testing and the inevitable snow days that we now seem to have in Alabama every year, when, from your point of view, we've had nothing but a dusting of snow or a little bit of ice overnight. But given that we have really no snow removal equipment whatsoever, you can imagine that we just hunker down and wait for it to warm up tomorrow. And go get bread and milk. That's the joke, right? If anyone is from the side. For unlike that universal anthology of sacred texts that I once used, which included chapters, predictably, on, it's universal after all, on not just the 10 expected world religions, but also on ancient religions, small-scale traditional society religions, new religions, and predictably, at least for anything Ian Smart was involved with, secular worldviews. Right? But also, unlike those maps of world religions, which you can easily find online or in classrooms, that give color-coded religious identity to pretty much every corner of the globe, we've come a long way since that category was first invented in the late 19th century. Right? In contradistinction to national or ethnic religions, now everyone in the world has a religion. That's kind of a fascinating history, and some of you may already be reading on that. Well, over the years, my focus has narrowed considerably, making my current introductory course, the one for which I wrote that book, seem, I think, incredibly specialized. After all, it's concerned solely with the problem of defining religion. That's all the book is on, and that's all the course is on. But again, I'd back off that term specialization. For to my way of thinking, the course and the book are incredibly general. Since whether students start out knowing it or not, by the end they come to realize, I would hope, that the course isn't on religion at all, but rather that we use the example of various attempts to identify something as religion as a series of opportunities for us to examine how we, as scholars, working in a public university, signify and compare things. Two skills that I think are applicable to any activity that we undertake as human beings. And at least in my way of thinking, that's what makes my course a core curriculum course, as we call it. We don't say Gen Ed, we say core curriculum on campus. And ironically, perhaps, an incredibly ambitious class despite the appearance of its narrow focus. Since I'm on the topic of specialization, and because I presume I'm talking here today with many people who either are or soon will be on the job market, let me digress just a little to express a frustration that I have. Speaking now as department chair who has seen his fair share of CVs and cover letters over the years. A number of the faculty, if you look at our faculty webpage, you'll find this easily. Only two of the people I now work with worked there before me. So I've been involved in hiring an awful lot of people. We've probably had, in my time there, we've probably had about 10 or 12 searches, and if you start to think of the number of people that apply to each job. So I've been involved in a number of searches, served on search committees in other departments. But a frustration that I have with how poorly I think we train many of our graduate students for eventual membership within a field, and that's how poorly prepared they sometimes are for seeking full-time employment as professors whose jobs will require them to work with other colleagues. The punchline here is we train a lot of specialists, but I don't think we necessarily train colleagues. Right? Case in point, last year we searched for a position in what we then termed in the ad, religion, global conflict, and the law. That was the ad title. The ad's main text read as follows. Proficient in critical and social theory, the ideal candidate will analyze the roles played by legal and religious systems in cross-cultural conflicts, whether physical, economic, racial, ethnic, or social. While the research specialty, region, and historical area are open, they should complement without reproducing the expertise of current faculty in the department, end quote. It went on to say typical university boilerplate that goes with all of our ads, but that was the main substantial portion. Now, I've written a little bit about the experience of the search and the afterward to a recent collection of essays I published last year with Brill. So suffice to say here that I tend to think that because we did not use any of the accepted keywords in our field, words like Buddhism or Judaism or religion and politics or religion in America or myth and ritual, we didn't use any of those words, that because of that, our ad was probably passed over by people who might have been directly relevant to what we were looking for. That's my hunch. We received around 40 applications. This past year, so this was the year before, this past year we did a search, we received over 100 applications. Sometimes I wonder if people are making assumptions about Alabama. There's probably a number of things going on there. But given the nature of the job market, if people are making assumptions about Alabama, then they have a luxury that I envy. I've seen people say, I applied to 75 jobs in the Northeast. And we all make choices, and are we willing to live with the results of our choices, I guess is the punchline. Because I changed countries for an 8-year instructor scheme. And not that that sets the standard, but I mean, what are you willing to do to achieve? And nobody can answer that, I think, except you, right? And so do we live with the consequences of our choices, knowing that we're in the larger structures, that we don't control all the choices that are on. We received around 40 applications and met some wonderfully gifted young scholars in the process, who I really hope, some wonderful young scholars find a place and a career in the field. It'd be wonderful to meet them at school meetings. But a very small group of applicants took seriously that we were looking not for a content specialist, for someone working on so-called peace building. We had received a number of applications like that. But for someone who could conceive of their work as being focused not on a ritual or a myth, but on a problematic, one applicable to any number of other situations, concerning how a variety of disputes and formal behavioral codes intersected with whatever it was that they meant by that designated religion. The words critical and social theory were, after all, the first things one read in the ad. Sure, we hoped they would be able to study this in detail at a specific site, ideally one that, as also stated explicitly in the ad, brought something new to a department that currently only covers so much of the world and its history. When I came there in 2001, we were 4.25 faculty with 2 cross appointments, right? It only adds up to 4 and a quarter. And this fall, counting our instructors line, we're going to be 10 people. So again, hopefully that cuts across any assumptions one has about Alabama. Like in this day and age of troubles in the humanities, we've more than doubled in size. Our university has doubled. I can tell you more about that. Our planned growth. It's not just us. But that they'd also recognize that the place where they do their work is just an instance of a wider thing that can also be seen elsewhere. From my experience, it is that ability that is at the heart of a departmental identity. That is, the ability of faculty members to see themselves as not just happening to have an office door next to someone, but as being in a common conversation with colleagues, despite our obviously widely divergent specialties, and even if we don't always agree on the issue. If you know anything about Culture on the Edge, you don't have to, but it's a research collaborative that I'm involved in. We have book series, books coming up. We have a blog pretty regularly. Leslie Darrow Smith posted one today. It's a research initiative that I'm involved with 6 other scholars. I think this nicely exemplifies what I'm talking about, let alone the department that I work in. I think nicely exemplifies. We're not idyllic. All departments have issues, but I think we nicely exemplify what I'm trying to talk about here. While some of you may have the luxury of finding jobs in large departments with highly specialized faculty positions, I'm reminded here of a story that I've cited before in print of a colleague at a search committee meeting at a school where I once worked, who who argued for a specialist in the epistles because, as he phrased it, he only did the Gospels. Maybe you'll get a job in a highly specialized environment like that. I only do the starter to eat on. Some people do get jobs in places like that. That's not certainly where I work. Many will instead more than likely be interviewing in places where no one works on what you do, no one knows much about what you do, and therefore it will fall to you to try to make connections with these people. Right? You're in an interview setting. It's going to fall to you to try to make connections with these people, to communicate the wider questions your work investigates, and to suggest its possible significance for the things they already know something about. And now here's my sly comment. Come to think of it, perhaps this is not a digression into the job market at all, for isn't this precisely the position you're in when you're teaching undergraduate students? And when it's phrased in this way, when the content which you've no doubt worked so hard to master, with language requirements and all that historical detail that you've worked to acquire, is seen as but one of many examples of things that we as humans cross-culturally do or produce, then I tend to think that our ad, that I read earlier, was the most general ad out there that hiring season. For I can think of very few people who could not have somehow, probably, creatively, perhaps, demonstrated their relevance for such a position. But because we did not phrase it in terms of the way that graduate programs, encyclopedias, professional societies, and publishers routinely divide up and thereby signify the pie, our ad probably stumped many who read it, perhaps prompting some to see it, dismiss it, and say that it was far too specialized. I don't do religion and law. That's probably how a lot of people saw it, I think. Which is really quite lamentable given how highly competitive the academic job market is. Thus, my frustration for the specialized silos into which we are all slotted, and how, because of that, we often fail to understand that the long-term well-being of a field of study, let alone the unit that we call a department, in which many of you will presumably hope to earn your daily bread, is directly related, I think, to the problems that we think worth tackling, that we collectively, that plural pronoun support here, is related to questions of method and theory. It is not so much not so much to the many different places where we do or do not happen to tackle those problems or questions. That so many early career people, understandably, focused on their dissertation's suitably narrow and focused topic. I'm not criticizing that. But they fail to think about the wider issues that their work exemplifies, and are therefore unprepared to discuss how this one specialty might not only intersect with the work of their potential colleagues, but might also contribute to the larger life and curriculum needs of a department, is, at least in my experience, a problem that many graduate programs, I think, need to consider addressing head-on, if they wish their graduates to continue to be competitive and successful in joining the ranks of our profession. But to return to the topic at hand, though, as you can guess, I don't really think that was much of a digression. I think that's the topic I'm talking about, as it's manifested in various places. I'd like to present to you a few of the, I think, interconnected choices, mostly in no particular order, though related to what I've been discussing so far, that I think you'll need to consider making in order to be effective in the introductory class. I admit that I can't resist the temptation to elaborate, so I'll deviate somewhat from Bruce's enviable success with a genre of bold, unelaborated thesis statements. I was one of the editors of NTSR when we got wind of his thesis on method that had been presented at the AAR, that had earlier been posted to his door. And I'm not sure if I'm the one who wrote him. I don't remember who wrote him, asking if we could publish it in NTSR. That's kind of a fun memory for me because those theses have had quite a life, I think. Of course, I'd happily elaborate on them even further, or on anything else for that matter, during our discussion, including the job market, including campus interviews, including transitioning to a position in an undergraduate degree-granting department such as my own. But, and so I begin. So it's a baker's dozen. So by the time I say 12, you'll know I'm almost. 1. Will your course be about gaining command over content, or will it be about the acquisition of skills that your students will find relevant in other courses and at other times? This I term the problem of applicability. For while knowing the name of the river crossed by whomever on such and such an occasion may come in handy in some future situation, should they go on to earn graduate degrees, enter our profession, or simply join a trivia night team at their local bar, being able to recognize that similar does not entail things being the same might have surprising relevance to all of your students in innumerable settings. I think that's a choice you have to make. I've made my choices for how I do this, and the way I state a number of these, it's heavily stacked in my favor. But I think that's something you really have to think about. Should you have the luxury of actually constructing your own course? I was given a textbook. Sometimes you're given a syllabus. 2, if your course is primarily about covering the material and command over content, then you are more than likely deferring to others to determine what your students ought to know. That is, how can a course on the history of religion in the U.S. not make mention of Jonathan Edwards, or what survey of Hinduism can avoid talking about its Indus River Valley's origins? These are all part of a well-known story on which you'll presumably be testing your students, much as others might quiz them on their grasp of tribal lore so as to determine the legitimacy of their membership, akin to tests of naturalized citizens. Name one branch of the government. This I term the problem of orthodoxy. For despite the now almost unheard of freedom that we have in our field of not having a national credentialing organization that sets standards, compels course content, and assesses student performance, we don't have that. But despite that, it strikes me that a surprising number of our field's classes conform to a very specific model, covering standardized, self-policed content. But if instead you opt to emphasize skills in your class, making your course about, for example, description and comparison, that's what my course is about. I happen to do it here, but my course is about, if that's the way you opt, then where will you choose to have your students try them out? At what sites will they give those methods a spin? This I term the problem of the EG. For there are times when, because the example you choose is alien to the student, so much of your time will be spent sufficiently describing the EG that you have no energy or time left to demonstrate how it serves as an instance of some wider issue you're trying to bring to their attention. Courses, like academic papers, can sometimes get lost in the details, prompting us to forget of what the EGs are an instance, leading us to sometimes see objects that we study as self-contained and self-authenticating. Third, thinking of this relationship between a course and an academic paper, will your class have a thesis? Is there something at stake of which you're trying to persuade your students, or is the information that you convey each class, each unit, merely items in a list that you've got to get through just so that you can have the satisfaction of completion, or maybe so that you can reuse last year's test? I know people who really fight not to do certain things so they can use last year's test. I can tell you a story about it. Will there instead be an argumentative point that, day by day, week by week, steadily develops, just as each paragraph of an essay has a place within the overall structure, and thus a purpose to it being placed here and not there? If so, then what will we do with those absent students who later come up and ask what they missed? Did I miss anything? The better question is, what did I miss? But sometimes, did I miss anything? No. For now, it's as if they've read an article with a page or two missing. Right? Like a PDF goes up and you've missed a page and they don't even know. Right? To address this, some professors now opt for so-called course capture systems, if you don't know what those are, such as Tegru, that's the name brand that my university uses, in which anything that passes through the hard drive of the multimedia system computer is captured on the web and can be replayed by the student. So wireless mic goes through the computer, the DVD tray, anything on the web, a monitor. I think they've gone out of business, but Symposium was the brand name of monitors that all of our multimedia podiums have, so that you can write on the screen, and that is also now on the overhead projector, it's on the Word document, it's on the PowerPoint. So some people now opt to do that, and then as a professor you can control when they see it. You want them to always see it just the night before the test. I think here are some of the early career people I've worked with who report that they have teaching experience, but who it turns out have never before taught a course where the goal is to persuade students of something, and thus the difficulty such instructors have when given an opportunity to lecture in a way that moves from a model of simply conveying discrete pieces of information to stringing together an argument that stretches over an entire semester. This I term the problem of persuasion. To return to the topic of EGs, will you approach your object of study as a pristine, a precious, and unique item, unlike all else in nature, whose study is a specialty unto itself, or will you invite students to see it as one among many arts de faire, as Michel de Certeau once phrased it, and thus something that is comparable to different, yes, but unexpectedly similar items from the all but limitless archive of human doings? In other words, will all the things that they study, read, and examine in your class be obviously religious, just picked from different places? Or perhaps will they find themselves reading, as my students do, an 1883 U.S. Supreme Court decision on whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable? Nix v. Heaven, you can easily find it online, right? Actual Supreme Court decision. Why? To help them persuade them that disputes over definition and identity, no matter how ethereal the object may seem, have practical motivations and practical effects. This I term the problem of analogies. Will you even have analogies? No, my object's unique. There is no analogy. 5. Because few undergrad students will enroll in their first year with any knowledge of what the academic study of religion is. After all, it's generally not taught in high schools, and if they go to a parochial school or a private school, there's a very good chance that it's certainly not what they'll be doing at a public university where I work. Then the vast majority of students therefore take our courses simply to satisfy the university's core curriculum or general education requirements. However, the irony is that it is from these very students that possible majors, the lifeblood of a department, technically the lifeblood of our department are graduates, but majors are the direct link to graduates. But that's the lifeblood of our department, graduates. From that group, that's where we will eventually recruit majors. Such classes are therefore both service courses to other departments, thereby generating credit hour production for our own, as well as a place where our department reproduces itself by creating potential majors and thus graduates. A side note, I was hired in 2001 as an outside chair to help revive the University of Alabama's department, since it was then graduating far too few students and it had been judged non-viable. That's the category used by our state credentialing board, the Alabama Commission on Higher Education. And because of that, we were slated to lose our major and become simply service department teaching core curriculum courses, perhaps closed altogether and faculty distributed elsewhere. When I came there, I was also 4.25 people. The only person with tenure. Everyone else was early career, thus making it a very exposed department to some sort of reorganization. I'm happy to say our reinvention, which took about a decade, these things don't happen overnight, but that, like all acts of social formation, is ongoing, was quite successful. So the people you mean to say that Russell McCutcheon is here to kill the academic study of religion, I really should say, go take a look at the University of Alabama. It's not me single-handedly, please don't think that, I'm not right, but, and I don't want to say it the wrong way, it's being taped for posterity, but I think we're kind of thriving, and there's a whole number of reasons why, some of which we have a direct role, some of which we had no role in whatsoever, and it's been fortuitous for us. So will you aim the books that you select, the topics that you examine, and the tone of your lectures toward those students who will more than likely never again return to one of our classes? Jonathan makes this point in some things he's written. Many of those students will never again return. Or the sometimes painfully small minority of budding specialists who may one day graduate from your department. Can you tell this is the problem of audience, right? Or better yet, as you plan and teach this class, will you have in mind those non-majors who, and you'd be amazed, and some of you in this very room might be this, who, when they are disillusioned with whatever their high school selves, their parents, or their one-time guidance counselors thought they ought to become, are reminded, maybe a year later, maybe 2 years later, of that interesting and cool and unexpectedly unique stuff that they did in your class, and how it made them think about, I don't know, why they set the table the same way even when they eat by themselves. Like those little connections I think you're wanting to make outside class, to get curious about the mundane, the taken for granted. And how are you going to make them curious about that? You know, the students who stop by your office long after a course is done to chat and enroll in a second course, and maybe a third, ... So to whom are you speaking when you plan a course and teach it? this is the problem of audience. And the problem is you probably have to address all these audiences simultaneously. And with that audience in mind, number 6, will you see your students as conversation partners, prompting them to read the cutting-edge work that so excites you now, as scholars, who are yourselves immersed knee-deep in dissertation writing or first book revisions? Or will you see in them yourself many years ago, long before you knew what the words dialectical, diacritical, and dialogical meant, or whether phenomenological was yet another of those dirty F words? I've been in sample teaching sessions. Our job candidates will teach a class, give an academic paper, where the person teaching the class is just going with those words, and you're sitting there at the back as the chair, knowing nobody in this room except the people sitting at the back know what all those things mean. So if you're going to use those words, is it worth teaching those words? Or don't even use them. This I term the problem of imagination. Can you imagine yourself as a 19-year-old, as a 20-year-old, long before knowing what you now take for granted? Or have you so naturalized your current state that you've forgotten the bumpy road you traversed in order to get here yourself? The interesting thing is that I think it takes great confidence just to say something simply, and to recognize that while they may ideally inform each other, and I think they ought to inform each other, there might always be a rather large gulf between one's teaching and one's research, one's students and one's colleagues. 7, with that last choice in mind, will you be the sort of lecturer who teaches students what you have already come to know, thereby turning classes into monologues, by which you transmit information by radiating it outward from its source behind the podium? Or instead, will you start from where the students themselves currently are, moving with them, even physically, moving among them as you teach, being brave enough to venture out from behind the protective, mask that is the lectern, going with them step by step toward a position by the end of the semester when they will have acquired the information that perhaps unbeknownst to them, you knew all along. There, I think, is a sleight of hand often to teaching. This I term the problem of proclamation. For there is a difference, I'd argue, between proclaiming what you know and teaching someone else how to know it as well. It's the old story of giving somebody a fish. A brief word of advice: carry a coffee mug as you lecture. It's small, smaller than a podium, but you can still hide behind it. Right? And you can strategically take a pause and a sip when thrown a curve. These things are here for many different reasons. 8, with yet another nod to Jonathan's own efforts to tease out their distinction, I suppose I should finally ask whether you will teach a survey or an introduction. For whereas the first is a broad overview and summary of a content domain, think here of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, soon to be joined on your shelves, if not already, by their new Anthology of World Religions. Just when you thought the World Religions category was bankrupt, Norton invests hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that tells you where that category is going. But the latter, an introduction, is, as Jonathan has made very clear in things he's written, that I have been influential with me, in its technical sense, it's a movement of something from outside in, or the entry of something foreign. Think here of a scientist who introduces some species of critter into a new environment, or how our letter of introduction, not unlike today's more professionalized letter of recommendation, once might have been your ticket to the best soirees and salons of the 19th century. For if a survey, then you must decide which mountaintops you will skip on, and which you will totally skip altogether, in your mere 40 hours of contact time to teach the history of the world. But if an introduction, and if you have the luxury of making your own course, then your goal is not coverage, but to devise ways to help novices acquire enough expertise to use the tools of our trade, an expertise that they may hone in subsequent classes. This I term the problem of initiation. 9. Given the state of higher education today, in which state legislatures are annually cutting budgets, in which for-profit corporations keep telling us the future lies outside the bricks and mortar of the traditional university campus, perhaps in MOOCs, if you massively open online courses. If you've not studied MOOCs, you should at least be aware of them, I think. Perhaps in terms of the MOOCs that they own and hope to sell to universities, possibly replacing you, right? What's the future? And in which publishers, in collaboration with some enterprising colleagues, aim to develop and deliver self-contained, cloud-based courseware that requires more, I would say, of an administrator than a professor to teach. Given all this, will you build your course around any one of the many prefab textbooks or course readers that are now in the market? Useful for an orthodox, these things all build my problems, right? Useful for an orthodox course based on covering the material, perhaps. Or will you develop resources of your own, such as finding and selecting PDF readings, in order to accomplish goals that are specific to you, specific to your sense of the field, and thus specific to your syllabus and your class? This I term the problem of governance. And whose course is it? Is it your course or is it Pearson's? As a slight variation on the last, given the state of higher ed today, I purposely repeat myself, but in which teaching loads are getting higher and higher. Case in point, I don't know if anybody's following North Carolina Senate Bill 593, entitled Act to Improve the Quality of Instruction at Constituent Institutions of the University of North Carolina, which would require a minimum 4-4 teaching load for all professors. So go find it on the web. That's currently being debated right now. I'm sure there's going to be exemptions for people who feel they're in a legal position. Will it be passed? And in which class sizes are getting larger and larger. Every faculty member in my department, case in point, teaches one large enrollment 100-level course each semester, ideally but not always with TA assistance. We've only very recently gotten TAs. For many years, the department would itself hire its own undergraduate seniors, but not TAs, but they could help with the logistics of a course. Handing something out to 150 people takes time, just the logistics of doing that, right? Something I admit, which was these large enrollments, was unheard of prior to me becoming chair. I'm the one who invented those in our department. But as I say, given these conditions, will you opt to build, as I asked last time, your class around any one of the convenient prefab textbooks course readers that are now on the market, thereby saving you, let's be frank, right? How many students are you teaching? Saving you considerable effort at conceptualizing and organizing your own course. After all, why reinvent the wheel? Or will you have the luxury of time that's so necessary to find and develop resources of your own that achieve a point unique to your own course? This I term the problem of time. Having a unique argumentative course might be a luxury that you just can't afford, given your setting. 11. Faculty in our department all teach 2-2. I assume you taught that way, a semester-based program, 2 courses in the fall, 2 courses in the spring. But we can afford that lighter teaching load because one of those courses is always large enrollment. Everyone's required to do that. So lower level, upper level in the fall, lower level, upper level in the spring. Each upper level is a different seminar. Each lower level is large enrollment. Large enrollments produce credit hour for curriculum courses, attract students. There's a logic to all this. Right? But good friends of mine elsewhere in the U.S. currently teach 4-4. Very productive scholars currently teach 4-4 that I know, with each class being a different course, right? So how many preps do you have? I assume you taught that way, right? How many different courses must you prepare? So a 4-4 teaching load where you're teaching 4 sections of the same course, though boring, is relatively easy compared to a 4-4 teaching load where every course is a different course, a different prep, right? So I know people teaching 4-4 with 4 different preps. So that's 8 different courses at the end of the year that you've taught, right? So given the number of classes you may be teaching each semester, coupled with both the number of students and the number of different class preps you may be doing, will your class provide students with an opportunity to write? Writing is so important to so many people. Critical thinking, writing skills. But what if you're teaching 4 classes of 100 people each? You know, and you don't have a TA. Will they write? Will they have an opportunity to get comments from you? To revise papers, resubmit them? Or will you rely upon optically scanned bubble scoring sheets, Scantrons, the company that we call ours, bubble sheets, that go through the optical scanner, and therefore rely on multiple choice tests? And if you opt for the latter, how can a multiple choice test assess more than just memorization? It can't. And will you be able to devise other inventive ways to engage and then evaluate students who find themselves one among the 150 others in your lecture hall, or larger or smaller? This I term the double-edged sword of the problem of engagement and assessment. 12. Should you decide all of the above in a manner that does not adequately complement the way your department's gatekeepers have made their decisions, then how will you either rethink those choices that are negotiable or perhaps strategically represent to your colleagues the results of your non-negotiable decisions, doing so in a way that helps you to acquire, ideally, a secure long-term space in which to carry out the work that you desire to do, despite the perhaps inevitable differences of opinion that can sometimes, dare I say, usually or often, characterize life in an academic unit. As an aside, I should say that we're an odd breed, I think, university professors. One of the sources, I think, of problems in departments sometimes. While likely seeing ourselves as freelance or self-employed, we also work within massive institutions that in many cases are supported by taxpayers and which constitute but one wing of the modern nation state. I work for the state of Alabama at the end of the day, and that's one unit within a nation state, making us more like employees of the DMV than many of us would likely want to think, rather privileged versions of that. This issue of negotiation representation, I simply term the problem of politics. Like I've been told on occasions early in my career to take the word theory out of the syllabus and put the word approach in. What do you do at that moment? Do you do that? Do you not do that? I was told early in my career that I had to add Peter Berger to my syllabus because that's what constituted theory in my department. I'm not a big fan of Peter Berger. No reason you shouldn't know about Peter Berger. He wasn't in my syllabus. Do I add Peter Berger? Do I not add Peter Berger? Are these negotiable for my unit? Problem politics. 13, and finally. Under your leadership, will the class constitute a group of curious observers intent on studying the alien and the exotic, separated from us, whether in time or geography, or will you continually remind your students that, as human beings themselves, whatever it is that we find curious about others ought to be no less applicable to ourselves? This is a riffing on one of Bruce's theses and thesis on why we do comparison. Whether we're scholars or not, thereby ensuring that the overall point of a course is to initiate a group of people who come to the class as already skilled users and navigators of a common sense folk system. For instance, they all know how to decipher Gilbert Ryle's and Clifford Gertz's wing. They all know how to do that, right? If you don't, we can talk more about that example. Without giving it any thought. They're all experts in your class. But who will hopefully leave as a very different sort of expert. One able to make the transition to seeing their own mundane as no less interesting than, for example, the curious things some Appalachian Pentecostals do with rattlesnakes. After all, we all hurtle down the interstates without a care in the world, don't we? Despite the National Safety Council's estimate of 35,200 people killed in U.S. traffic accidents in 2013 alone. Now, why do we find snake handlers so fascinating when we really should find us driving on interstates far more fascinating? Right? Or are you going to try to make your students find that fascinating? This I term the problem of identification. I'm sure there are many other choices an instructor needs to make, no less significant choices than I think a newly minted PhD has to make, such as whether seeing the thing they're currently writing or working on as being added to the book manuscript that used to be the dissertation, or whether it's a new thing they're working on and they ought to just close the door. Like knowing when to end a project, I think is difficult for some early career people. Or failing to understand that once you climb, I said this at dinner last night, the mountain of the dissertation, what a focused mountain to climb, the ideal goal is that someone will now say to you, okay, do that again, and do that again, and that's called your second book, and that's called your third book. Right? Making that transition into seeing the long-term career is sometimes a big transition. But that's a tough choice in another part of our profession that I think is no less worth thinking about. But these are at least a few of the issues and decisions that I know I and others had to navigate. Correction, continue to navigate. I think you should continue to navigate these problems. Every class you teach is different. The circumstances of higher education change. And so I put them before you today. Applicability, orthodoxy, EGs, persuasion, analogies, audience, imagination, proclamation, initiation, governance, time or time management, engagement, assessment, politics, and identification. To invite you to begin thinking a little more about your situation as a teacher in university and thus what you choose to tackle with those undergraduate students during your 40 hours or less together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Russell McCutcheon. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure there's plenty more to cover, so let's open it up.
I'm happy to talk about anything. Well,
Coffee cup high.
but kind of really. You've taught introductory courses, right? Nobody else has taught introductory? That particular. Who has taught an introductory course other than Introduction to the Study of Religion? Okay, so introductory in, who just here?
Literature.
In literature?
Philosophy of orientation.
Who was, I don't know who was?
Hinduism?
Hinduism?
Buddhism and philosophy.
Buddhism, philosophy? Were there others?
Introduction to philosophy.
Introduction to philosophy. Same choices in those areas, or no? It's already so, no? That's an aggressive no. Why not?
When I teach introduction to philosophy, I teach reading as a humanities class, and I think of students having to get skills for others. Other classes, when I teach introduction to Buddhism, because it's also a higher level, 200 to 400, I see that as different. I still want students to be able to write papers, but I see also that I do think that I need to give them content, because I do think that at the end of the quarters, they will feel like they have learned something.
In an ideal world, it's recruiting for other courses in Buddhism too, isn't it? Right?
So looking at the syllabus that you gave, where you use your book, I thought it was really interesting, and I just would love to hear your kind of background thinking about why you made these decisions, about assessments, about the fact that you have two tests, testing content, very, kind of like the who and the what,
Yeah.
the names and what in particular terms, when we've been talking so much about skills and, obviously the other assignment you have of kind of finding these different definitions of religion. I can see kind of being on the other side, but just any thoughts you had about why you made that decision?
Oh, yeah, it's a pretty conscious decision. There's a lot of reasons behind it. Let's see, the best way to start. I've not done in-depth research for my students or get an IRB approval, but informally talking to them when they come by the office, which rarely happens in my experience. Nobody comes to office hours. I don't know what happens here, but we still set them. I think that's university's way of forcing employees to come to work. They don't just want to stay at home. Somebody needs to study the history of office hours. My guess is they were invented in the 70s or so. My guess is, right? Because people prior to that probably just came to work. Work 8 to 5 or whatever. But when I talk to students, it becomes clear that when they come into my class, it's very disorienting for them. That I don't use PowerPoint. I refused to do that for a long time. And now my concession toward that is it allows me to feel good about myself because I'm not using PowerPoint. But I go into Word and I make a big Word document. I still use PowerPoint. Put it up on the screen. And it has, a quotation on it. It's in the order I know I want. It has, something happened in the news today that's relevant. So you do a screenshot from the New York Times and you got a link and you're going to talk about it. So I might as well do PowerPoint, but I don't, because it's kind of my own sanity, I think, is probably linked to, but I never did that before. I just stood up and started talking, right? The students had great difficulty with that. I think this is one of those, I better anchor myself in my own text. Was this negotiable or non-negotiable for me? And I'm certainly not thinking of that when I made this decision, but I remember, it just doesn't work for them because they're very used to, I would query students, and they would tell me they would take science courses where the lecture notes, they call them lecture notes, were posted online before the class, and it was, when you could print your PowerPoint slides out, and they're this big, and then your note is beside it, or whatever you call it, and that would be there for the whole lecture, except key words were missing, underlined. And so the lecture notes were follow along the lecture and write the key word in, right? And I don't know if I first heard that when I was in Missouri or where I was. And so knowing that that's what my intro course, not literally that, but that's a quick little EG, was up against, to reach the students, to engage them, that they're wanting, it strikes me that they're wanting just the facts. They're not necessarily getting that, and I would say this to them at certain points in the course, not necessarily getting that, as I said to you guys at the start, I'm their data, I think, in the course, that I'm going to model for them, for this course, a way to talk about human behavior. I'm going to model for them a way to problem solve. I'm going to model for them a way to be curious about things that I've said I'm going to put beside each other. Let's call it comparison, right? I'm going to model that for them for the semester, and it's up to them to be, I have a thesis, persuaded by that or not. And I think the changing environment at the university makes that very difficult for a lot of them to do, right? So how am I going to deal with that? Right? So I've been teaching this course ever since I first started my career in 1993. And it's slowly developed, right? So it's a completely different course, but so at some point, I don't know, I think I made an agreement with myself that they don't quite know this. If you sit there for this period of time and watch me, not watch me, but right, let me model this for you, mull that over. In exchange for that, I'm going to give you a test that's probably going to be very familiar to you in some ways. So here we have a book, and that's why I wrote the book that way. I'm going to bold what I think are important words you know. They're going to be in a glossary, scholars. What do we have to know about these scholars? So many things. Do you know when they lived? So if I say a late 19th century, blah, 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 can you now plot that person? Do you know what area of the university they worked in? Do you know why we're talking about that person? That's what I literally said. And this Thursday, they have a test. You've seen that. I moved the test by a day because I came here. So that's an unarticulated deal I'm making, right? On the one hand, very pragmatic. On the other hand, I teach 100 to 150 students, right? As a department chair, my teaching load is 1-1. I will often do 1-2. I choose to do that. I have other responsibilities. So how can I construct this course? So I use multiple choice tests, right? But my multiple choice tests, I try, I think it works, work very hard, and I tell them how to study, I think, for them, to prompt them to consider how knowledge works. I think knowledge has something to do with making connections between things, right? We can only know something, any of you study comparison, in light of something else, A, not A, etc. So if you know one thing about something we talk about, you're probably screwed on the test, because there's a very good chance I'm not going to ask you that one thing, And we've not read Freud for 2 months in my class. Just how much will we have to know? But you probably got to know 5 things about Freud, 6 things about Freud. So do you know the id? Do you know something about transference? Do you know whatever we've talked about in that lecture? So the multiple choice tests are always constructed kind of like quadratic equations, right? A plus B plus C. And I'm going to give you a number of variables, and I'm going to leave one of those out. After all, isn't that what a multiple choice test is? And I'm asking if you can find that missing variable from the choices I'll give you. So the tests are constructed in such a way where I'm trying to assess not just their memory of terminology, but their ability to connect discrete items into, hopefully, sentences. So I'll say, when you're studying, listen up, if this gets posted. Can you eventually construct entire sentences of our technical terms and know what the sentence says? So-and-so, who was an essentialist, which is different from being a functionalist, was, because now probably whatever I throw at you on the multiple choice test, you're going to have no problem with all these variables, because you're going to immediately be able to eliminate 2 of them, right? You're then going to have to reason through. It's like the all of the above, none of the above. If you know one thing about the question, you're kind of screwed, because everything else could also be correct and you don't know. So, maybe that's rationalization. I'll be quite frank. But given the practical setting, what I'm trying to accomplish in the course, I've decided that is a manageable exchange that I can live with. This is the first time, I think, what did I do last semester? I've taught both semesters this year. I think I did something different. That syllabus is sitting, if you change the URL, you can find that syllabus online too. But often I'll have a test per unit. 8 tests, boom, boom, boom. Every 2 weeks they have a little test, And the logic of doing that is, I blog a lot. I didn't want to start blogging when blogging became a thing. Because I just knew I got this nervous energy and I'll just blog. So I finally started last year and they just pour out, right? Because if you've taught long enough, you're just filled with anecdotes and all kinds of little EGs that you can just whip out quickly and talk about, and that, what a great little 500-word blog post. Right? And I think I wrote about this once, that I've had students complain to me that my courses are only out of 100. Right? Like my course is out of 100. Because they'll say, I don't know how you guys do it here, however, they'll also say, my blah 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 course is out of 875. Right? And I don't know why professors do that. My hunch is it's because they just made a test with 32 questions on it. So this test is out of 32. Or this question's a little tougher, so all these are worth 1 point, but these 5 are worth 2 points each, and suddenly the test, and they don't convert it to something. And so the students will come to me. I've had this actually, where they think I'm shortchanging them by making my course out of only 100. And I'm not kidding. And so I jokingly would say that maybe I should teach 2 sections of the exact same course one semester and make one out of 1 billion. With 10 assignments worth 100 million each. And the other course out of 10. 10 assignments worth 1 each, right? To press upon them, and I don't know if this is No Child Left Behind, I don't know if this is basic math skills, but it's kind of a problem. But I come back. What I'll say to them is, to me, it's not what the course is worth. It's how many opportunities you have to earn the grade. And if you really screw up on this, how will that affect your long-term performance? So I changed that this semester, quite purposely, because I've not done 2 tests in a final in a long time. But often I'll have a whole bunch of things. So by the end of the semester, the students had maybe 10 or 11 different opportunities to earn something out of 10, something out of 10, something out of 10, which I would hope would moderate bad performances. This year I decided, no, I'm just going to do, I'm teaching overload this year, to be frank. And I said, no, I'm going to do 2 tests. But then if you've seen the syllabus, I last semester I amended this, and I was like, okay, I'll live with this. But you can opt right to final. What do you think your performance has been? And if you wish to, okay, we'll lessen your test performance by 50%, and now you're going to write a final. And unbeknownst to them, the final is going to be largely based on the first 2 tests. They take their test with them after the end of class. I release the grading key to it, because to me, the course is about improving. The course is not about being penalized for a poor performance, right? The course is about improving from your mistakes. Like I think, maybe not all of life is like that. Hopefully, a hunk of life is like that. And I have an anecdote about that. At one point in time, I had a student who, the grading key can be a little confusing to some students. We have this automated system that scans and the students get their grades back, or this adult sheets. And the student had memorized all their incorrect answers from the previous 2 tests. And so when they came to the final, which turned out had great resemblance to the previous tests, the student had perfectly transposed all their incorrect answers. So they knew they had done it perfectly, but what they didn't know is that they had done it incorrectly perfectly. So they got an abysmal performance. They came to my office really angry. And I quickly reasoned out and looking, well, you read the key wrong and you memorized all the wrong answers. And you reproduced all your errors from the first 2 tests. But, is that a good answer? Does that work?
Yes. So I guess I've heard you say several things, but one thing was familiarity for students.
That was a big driver.
Yeah.
That's a real impediment to the course is they just don't get it. Now I don't want to just paint them all with the same brush, but so many of their other courses are textbook, standardized exam. They might be in professional schools where there are professional credentialing bodies that determine curricula, where they only have one elective they can take. And I teach the intro course like it's a seminar. That's a big class, but I walk around, talk about something. I get the mic and I walk all over to try to minimize the distance, right? To hopefully the class feels smaller. You're right there talking to them, without a coffee. Go. But it seemed to be a strategic move I had to make to be familiar enough to them, to inspire them to grant me to be strange, the space to be a little weird, right? Because without that, it was just all a little, maybe 30 years ago would have been familiar, or whatever that time period in the way our universities have changed. But at least teaching at the University of Tennessee, what was originally called Southwest Missouri State University, now called Missouri State. I was there for 5 years, and now 14 years at Alabama. A number of the students who have gone through No Child Left Behind have gone through a very standardized testing environment that these are now the the adults that we're teaching. It seemed a necessary move, I thought.
So, in reading through your syllabus and in reading through the book, I understand the ways that these things work together, and the book, in a sense, is a record of how you teach the class and then the blueprint for your teaching the class. But I'm curious whether others have used this book as a textbook, and if you've heard any feedback from them about how they've maybe modified your blueprint in their own contexts and the ways that they've built on it and how that's played out.
I think I don't know how widely it's used. It was originally published with Equinox. I think that's what's on the spine. And Equinox, a press that I like a great deal. I post a number of things with this small British press. Very committed to a certain way of talking about the study of religion, plus publishing all kinds of other things. And then they merged with Acumen, and they became this conglomerate, small. And then they had a messy divorce, and Rutledge now has bought, you realize, right, these soap operas of the publishing industry. So Taylor Francis, which owns Rutledge, has bought this. So now Rutledge owns this. So I don't, I get reports just on sales, so I don't know how many different people have used it. I know a number of people have. From the ones who I talked to, it sounds like, and maybe that's because they're the ones they say what I want to hear, so that's why I remember them. But they use it to set their table. They'll use it one of two ways. They'll use it, as you saw, if you look through it, if you're not reading the definitions in the back, and 2 undergraduate students help me prepare the book, in my department. There's a project they got paid for in the summer, about, 2006 or something like that. If you don't read that, you can read those little chapters pretty fast. They're 4 pages long, 5 pages, 3. That was very intentional on my part. So you could use the book, I think, in any course within the first week or two. I do know people who use it that way. Not an introductory course, just some course where they want to ensure a quick crash course of a common vocabulary for what we're going to do in this class. I can ramble with the best of them, so that's why I stick to the text, because I'm good as I ramble. Because I don't know about the departments any of you have experience in maybe MAs before coming here, if you're in a PhD now, or your own BA, or if you're working in one. But in our department, we can't afford, I think like a lot of departments, the luxury of prerequisites. At the upper level, we'd love to have prerequisites. So we had this seminar of common basis of knowledge, but we need credit hour production. And so every one of our courses feels like an introductory course to some extent. Because you're going to have people in that 300 level or 400 level. We do 100, 200, 300 for the undergrad levels, right? You're going to have people in that classroom who have never taken a class. Or maybe minors who have done a few, but not nearly the same number as the majors. So that was partly the audience I had in mind. I do know some people who use it that way. In almost any class, to just quickly set the table in terms of issues, conversations, and you don't have to want to talk essentialists and functionalists. But if you want to talk that way about the field, you've just done that. The other way I know it's used is the way that I think I mainly considered when I'm writing it, was it broadly lays out issues, but spend 2 or 3 weeks on one particular chapter, because you're going to now bring in this example and this example, and maybe your examples will have some kind of world religion-y feel to them. Is that what you do? Maybe the examples will all be from, American religion, or who knows. But inviting the instructor, and I think, I don't even remember, I might have even written that in the opening of the book, I think, as I recall. As I said here, you've got to bring all the rich kind of EGs. I'll give you a bit of a structure to talk about these things, but it's not my course. I'm giving you a structure. Yeah, I'm having a role. It's your course, so how do you want to go with this? So I do know people who use it that way. But it's not nearly as widely adopted as a textbook. Because I still think there's a lot of reasons why people use textbooks, I think, and I don't want to demean using textbooks. Because depending on your teaching situation or conditions, it's a rational choice. It's a very reasonable, rational choice to use it. And I think more and more people are in that situation that makes it a reasonable, rational choice. That would mean a book like this would be a lot more work for them. It's like the students coming into my class. It'd be a curve. It's like, well, no, I know I got to cover, because it's saying, well, what do you think you have to cover? Like, take really seriously that we don't have a national credentialing body. And we don't have, that day might come, who knows, right? That day might come. See, the AR is going to send out an email. We've now signed up with the AFL-CIO, I don't know, right? So, like, that's what I find so interesting about the field. So few people really embrace that freedom, just embrace it. Now, you might have a department chair looking over his shoulder, a tenure committee. Sure, we might have that credentialing board much more locally. But perhaps you don't. So, my gosh. What do you think they need to know? What a scary but kind of liberating position to be in. And I think that's what I hope the book would be enough structure for someone to start making decisions within. So there's a structure. But now, sky's the limit. So those seem to be the 2 ways.
Do you predominantly lecture?
In the 100 level class?
Just across the board, what's your style or method?
If I teach an upper level class, so we'll say 100, 200 lower level, 300, 400 upper level classes, right? I think you talk that way, or your undergrad did that. In an upper level class, ideally it's 15, 20, 12 students, 15, 20. It'd be nice to be a little on the larger side, just in terms of student as a chair, credit hour production, right? Long-term well-being of how we all pay our mortgages, and like these things are all linked, right? In that setting, we're sitting around a common table. Ideally, we get a good classroom. Sometimes it's tough to get the real classroom you like. They might have an assignment of some sort for that day. Is there a seminar? Does somebody have to talk about something? Is someone prepared? But almost every one of those classes, I always come with something to start the class off. Something that goes up on the screen. What do you make of that? Some goofy EG, something in the news, something that I think is directly relevant to what we're doing. And ideally then it just turns into a really big conversation that I think my role, like in a seminar, is to direct and move. Sometimes I'll go on and on about something that I think they should know about that's background, but often I'm listening. In a 100 level class, I'm lecturing. I have a Word document up there that I scroll through that gives the quote. There's a picture of Marx, and there's a quote from him from what they read. What do you think? But I like I said, I have a wireless mic on, and I'm walking around, working hard to get as much engagement as I can from the students who are there. And in a large enrollment class, I find that there's always going to be 5 or 6 or 7, whatever the number of students you can go to that are going to say something, that aren't shy, that aren't nervous. And the goal is to try to engage more and more of them to talk. But in that class, yeah, it's a lecture.
Do you feel a tension between what I think, so based on your work that I've read, and what I think is underlying this a decent amount of anti-orthodoxy. So, I mean, I think an attempt to push against
Counter-orthodox.
Yeah, counter might be a nice way to say it. At least an attempt to push against what you see as a standard way of doing things. It's potentially problematic and dangerous. The lecturing is a big part, I think, of that system of orthodoxies. Do you feel a tension between your goals to shake things up, to offer students an alternative, and being forced, at least by your class size, to lecture? How do you get around that, or is it not possible to get around?
I'm thinking back to the earlier question here, actually. When I came to Alabama, as I said in the talk a little bit, the Alabama Commission on Higher Education had declared us non-viable. So the governor of the state, every state for public education has such a body, right? You can't just invent a master's degree, right? Your own university has to authorize it, some state board has to authorize it. So this is the board that does that, appointed by the governor, which makes it a political phenomenon in some ways. They kind of have more teeth at times and less teeth, you know, how politics and education. So in the late 80s, the Alabama Commission on Higher Education asserted itself very strongly in the state, right? And the late 90s, such that some institutions were closed, you know, many institutions were rolled in together. One of the great ways of dealing with graduation rates is to combine programs, and now your graduate numbers go up. So you no longer have a struggling German department and a struggling French department, because you now have a modern languages department with one major, right? And in situations like that, like Spanish programs that largely drive the success of these other programs that used to be successful in the 50s and 60s, right? So our department has to graduate 7.5 majors every year. So I think I mentioned this last night. It's a 3-year rolling average, continually rolling, 7.5. An MA program has to graduate a certain number. I think it's like 3.25. A PhD program is like 1 point something. I forget that number, right? If not, your viability is at stake. You could lose the degree. So by the time I got there, they had done a number of things after getting an early warning shot that had increased the graduation rate. They had about a 2-year grace period, but we were still below the 7.5. So my first job as a chair was to write a waiver application to the Alabama Commission on Higher Education to say why they shouldn't take our major away. This long document. And then at one point, a bunch of chairs got in a van and drove to Montgomery, our state capital, for the Alabama Commission on Higher Education's meeting, so that we were all in the room should they say, now what about this? Well, people stand. But luckily, none of us were called upon. They granted the waiver. So come all the way back now. How are we going to do this? We need credit hour production. We need large courses to teach a number of students to persuade the university that we're productive. I'll use that language, productive. But those are also the classes where we find majors. Right? That's where they're going to find us, because if they don't take that course, they'll probably never know the academic study religion exists. They're probably going to take history, because they know history exists. And history has a number of people, as we were talking earlier, who teach this thing called religion. You know, they could go there. So for me, the choices I've made, go back to, right, I have no trouble living with them because they assist the department. That's kind of one of my chorusy things here, to think about the department, to achieve its longer-term goals from which I benefit, from which the students benefit. And one way I can accomplish that is to, yes, seeming to do some rather traditional things in certain venues, but I do hardly traditional content in that venue, because at the end of the day, I'm asking them to make data of themselves. I'm asking them in a 100-level way to mull over why we call anything religion. Can you be curious about that a little bit? What's the difference between a religion and a cult? What's the difference between religion and science? What's the difference between religion and magic? Like, this is kind of the way the course goes. Have you ever really thought about how classification works? And have you ever heard of Mary Douglas? Let's read a little bit of Mary Douglas, right? Let's read some tomatoes and fruits and vegetables. So again, I think it's a similar bargain I'm making with them. I'm going to give you a traditional presentation you're kind of familiar with, but the form and content, the form's going to be traditional. think that buys me a luxury or an opportunity to give them very non-traditional content. And I think it's always a relationship between those two, you know. You don't want to lose them, you know. Oh God, you know, here he goes again talking about, is a whale a mammal or a... Does anybody know the book Trying Leviathan? As in a trial? Trying Leviathan. Fantastic book. Historian D.G. Burnett. It's on a very particular New York State trial in the year early 1830 on whether whales were mammals or fish. It's a fantastic book because it turns out, can you just see where this is going? That there was a tax on importing fish oil, and this is right at the time in Europe that anatomical classification is starting to replace classifying things based on their shape. It looks like oil. And it's this fantastic book in detail on nothing but that trial. So can I give them a traditional format, but stop for a moment and get them to say, why the hell do we think, we all know whales are mammals, but can we take seriously that for the vast majority of human history, that was a really silly thing to say, because we just know they're fish, right? Melville's really big fish, yeah, we all know they're fish. So I think that's, it's not always conscious on my part, you know, sitting here, I'll make up a reason for almost anything. But it means at times it's a conscious deal I think I'm making with them. I'm going to give you something familiar, and in that familiarity, to riff on familiarity, I'm going to try to tweak something you take for granted. And do it in a, not a goofy, fun, you know, I'm not doing stand-up, but I mean, I read about a tomato. What the hell does that have to do with, well, sooner or later, I'm hoping that they start to make the connections later that there's huge things at stake in that. If I'm importing tomatoes from the West Indies, as these people, the Nix family were doing, like I'm importing thousands and thousands of pounds of tomatoes, and maybe I really care that there's an import tax on vegetables, but not an import tax on fruit. And maybe now I'm going to care how the biologists classify tomatoes, and maybe now I'm going to take that tax collector, which is the case, to court, and said, you improperly classified them, and I need that money back. Right? So I think there's always this foreign content, at least for me, negotiation going on, especially when you walk into a room with 100 or 150 undergraduate students who are largely there for core curriculum credit, some feeling disengaged, some incredibly enthused by the material. I don't want to misportray, some really enthused by it, because they've never before thought of, you know, I talk in the book, maybe some of you have seen the Englishman who went up a hill and came down a mountain, or was but they've never thought of that before, that there's something at stake to saying whether there's a hill or a mountain. So I think that's a constant, for me, negotiation.
Can we take one more very brief question, and then we'll have to call the session to close? If not, then...
I was waiting, but no one else is going to jump in. Well, I have kind of two questions, so pick one of the following. One is, or do I need to have three?
None of the above could be the last. I might offer C.
My first question is the role of EGs that you don't put on the table, and neither do they, but they are in their minds throughout the course. And so they're part of an implicit dialogue about the definitions, but are not publicly necessarily available or drawn on. So that students who come in assuming religion is like Southern Baptist service I went to once, or it's like, so the EGs. Then the second is, I wonder, your choice continually to emphasize etymologies, whether that, what work that is doing, and the degree to which you have to work against a kind of etymological fallacy on the part of the students, that words are the Greek word from which they come, right? And so why do you do that then? Or, you know, or do they get received as definitions in UChicago? Or none of the above?
Oh,
Or
well,
all of the above?
I'll take B for 500. Culture on the Edge, edge.ua.edu. Go see our blog. We have a little volume. I added a little volume. A whole bunch of blog posts have been written on origins, it turns out. So let's have a little volume on origins. It's called Fabricating Origins. I love Jonathan has an early paper on why imagine religion. It's unpublished, where he says, maybe I should have called imagining religion fabricating religion, because it cuts in two interesting ways of fakery, but right, it's kind of so. That's all stuck with me. In which we've revised 10 posts on origins issues, and then invited 10 ABDs that I just kind of know in the country who seem to do interesting work, who respond to each. It's a nice little volume. I try to bring that attitude into the class when we talk about etymology, that there is a danger that they'll think that just because, in a classic origins argument, right, just because something comes from there, that's how it ought to be, normative. So I do explicitly address that in the class many times. I'll come back to that. Now, by the way, right, what I'm trying to accomplish by that is to, Frederick Jameson, right, is to historicize in their minds a folk knowledge that they take for granted, that we all take for granted. We all use to navigate the world, to come into buildings, out of buildings, to meet people on time, right? We all know how to decipher, Lyle's and Wink, right? We know whether it's a come on or whether it's a whatever, right? Not always the usual. So what I'm trying to do, I think, back to orthodox, unorthodox, is through the etymology to try to get a little wedge in their taken for granted way of talking about the world by, if they believe me, writing a book, by suggesting to them that whales haven't always been mammals, right? By suggesting that, oh, by the way, cult has not always meant what Time magazine covers think it means. And thus, this next, so what's it going to mean for you, right? So I think a number of the things that I've written in my own career, I think are related to this. I think a number of the things that I've tried to do is to try to suggest to people, because I think as time's gone on, I've realized that a number of my intended audience is probably myself 20 years ago. I didn't know that at the time, and maybe I've rationalized that, but I think I'm writing to myself then. So maybe to some people in this room. I'm trying to say things could be otherwise. You don't have to talk about these items in this particular way. It could be otherwise. And now that you know it could be otherwise, there's now a comparative point on the table, right? What are you going to do about it? Right? How are you going to be a scholar? How are you going to talk about it? So I think the etymology functions for me to give the not a moment. Because they know what cult is, they know what religion is, they know what belief is, that they're the experts in that, right? And to quickly say, oh, by the way, did you know in the 16th century, by the way, did you know that religion is not in ancient Greek literature? So when we read the Euthyphro or the Ephthro, depending how you want to say it, anytime you see religion there, that word is always to open up that gap, and then the challenge implicitly is, what are you going to do with that gap now? Do that?
So we need to call the session to a close. We have the room. Feel free to get more coffee and stick around and continue the conversation. Please do join me in giving a very warm thank you to Russell McCutcheon.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.